You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. In the last episode, we began a fascinating conversation about the long history of human interest in kink and BDSM. Today, we're going to dive even deeper into the subject. One of the topics we're going to consider is how major cultural events have played a role in shaping kinky interests. For example, there's a surprising story to be told about how World War II and military imagery came to be associated with sadomasochism. Also, part of the reason sadomasochism has long been controversial is that it was historically linked to fascist politics. So we're going to delve into some of the tensions surrounding this. We're also going to talk about how kink and BDSM have been portrayed in the media and some of the controversies about how it has been presented. On the one hand, portrayals that haven't necessarily been super accurate, think 50 Shades of Grey, have helped to normalize kink and make it more accessible to the masses, but they've also played a role in spreading some misconceptions about kink. So, what do we want from our media portrayals of kink and other minority sexualities? Let's talk about it. I am joined once again by author, historian, and journalist Peter Tupper. He runs the History of BDSM blog and wrote the book A Lover's Pinch, A Cultural History of Sadomasochism. This is going to be another fascinating episode. Before we get to the main topic for today, though, here is our Just the Tip segment presented by Popstar. Popstar was founded by two sexual medicine doctors who are creating science-backed products to help support male sexual health and pleasure. Whether you want to last longer, finish stronger, enhance your health, or just make sex more pleasurable, they have a solution for you. In our Just the Tip segments, I'm sharing tips and tricks to help men boost their bedroom confidence and performance. Today, we're diving into the subject of how to fix low libido in men. Let's talk about it. There's this idea out there that men are always DTF, like constantly horny, always ready to go, and if they're not initiating sex, that something must be wrong with them. But that's not the full story. The truth, a lot of men actually struggle with low sexual desire, and they're just not talking about it, maybe because of shame. But it's way more common than you think. For example, in a nationally representative survey of 2,000 American adults we conducted at the Kinsey Institute, we asked people about a variety of sexual problems they'd experienced in the past year, including issues with low desire. What we found was that men and women were actually similarly likely to report this problem, with 21% of men saying that they had low sexual interest compared to 23% of women. We hear a lot in the media about low desire in women, but it turns out that it's actually quite common across genders. So let's talk about what's really going on when your libido takes a dip. First off, there are a ton of things that can affect sexual desire. Stress, sleep problems, relationship issues, anxiety, depression, poor body image issues. All of these things can put a damper on desire. And let's not forget medical issues like cardiovascular disease and chronic illnesses, as well as mental health issues. On top of that, a lot of medications that people take, including things like SSRIs, can reduce desire. We often hear that low desire is something that's just in your head, but that's such a drastic oversimplification. It's truly a biopsychosocial phenomenon. So that brings us to the question of what can you actually do about it? Well, let's start with lifestyle. Research shows that regular exercise, especially things like strength training, can actually help. And it works on multiple levels. For one thing, it can increase testosterone, but it can also help improve blood flow throughout the body. In fact, some guys find that it's actually easier to get an erection after a little workout. Working out consistently over time can also improve body image, so there can be a psychological effect here as well. But it's important not to overdo it with exercise. Like everything else in life, do it in moderation, because excessive exercise can actually dampen desire. Now, beyond exercise, look to things that can reduce stress. Also, focus on getting solid sleep, cut back on alcohol, and eat foods that support overall health. I know we hear these things all the time, but they really do work. And if lifestyle changes don't seem to cut it for you, speak with your healthcare provider because there could be some underlying physical or mental health condition or medication you're taking that could be messing with your desire. So it's important to get a thorough evaluation to pinpoint the underlying cause so that you can find the appropriate treatment. Now, a lot of guys assume that the fix is always testosterone. TRT, or testosterone replacement therapy, is really blowing up right now. But here's the catch. Low testosterone isn't always the problem when low sexual desire is present, and throwing hormones at it isn't always the solution. It turns out that a lot of guys who think they have low testosterone are actually in the normal range. It's not too low. And so boosting testosterone might not actually help them much. And if you increase your testosterone too much, that can actually be dangerous and it can cause other health problems. With testosterone, more isn't always better. So before you hop on a protocol, it's crucial to get your levels tested and talk to a real healthcare provider to make sure that it's right for you. And finally, one more tip. Don't overlook the power of intimacy and connection. Sometimes low desire is less about biology and more about feeling disconnected from your partner. Contrary to popular belief, most men want to feel desired. And for them, feeling desired by their partner is one of the keys to wanting sex. Sometimes desire goes away because we become disconnected from our partners. So it's important to make that space for meaningful intimacy. The bottom line, if your libido's off, you're not broken. You're human, just like everyone else. And there's hope. There are lots of ways to potentially get your libido revved up again. All right, that wraps up our Just the Tip segment presented by Popstar. A huge thank you to our friends over at Popstar for sponsoring this segment and helping us all to have better and more pleasurable sex. We have much more ahead on today's show, so stick around and we're going to jump in right after this short break. Join me for an online training at the Kinsey Institute about the latest research on sexual fantasy. I've studied the sexual fantasies of more than 10,000 people from all around the world, and I'll be sharing everything I've learned in this workshop. You'll learn what we know about where our fantasies come from, the deeper meaning behind our fantasies, how fantasies evolve across the lifespan, cross-cultural differences in fantasies, and so much more. This course is open to anyone who's interested in learning more about the topic, but it will also offer applicable skills and frameworks for clinicians, educators, researchers, and sexuality professionals. Participants will receive a certificate of completion from the Kinsey Institute. This course takes place on Saturday, July 19th. Check the show notes for the link or visit knsy.in/fantasy-science. Okay, Peter, let's continue our deep dive into the cultural history of BDSM. So there are a lot of cultural events that we can point to in the past as having some significant indirect effects on our sexuality, including kink and fetish interests. And one of them is World War II. So, for example, I interviewed historian Esme Louise James on the show a while back, and she talked about how nylon stockings really came to be eroticized during the war because nylon became a scarcity. All of it was being used for parachutes and other military purposes, and women were even donating their nylons to the war efforts. So it became this rare and kind of exotic thing to have nylons, and that seemed to amplify their erotic desirability. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about World War II and some of the ways that you think that it influenced BDSM practices and interests.
Well, a lot of this can be traced back to the Leatherman culture. And that was the idea of these gay or queer men who were demobilized. They didn't really feel they belonged in post-war society. And they often joined up into the motorcycle culture. And that included wearing the leather jackets that were issued to air crews, air pilots. This became associated with a kind of outlaw masculinity. So I believe it was 1953, you had the Wild One, which was loosely based on a riot between two biker gangs in a small California town. And this was made into a movie starring Marlon Brando as Johnny, who became sort of the archetype of the brooding, masculine, outsider, rebel man. This became the image of the American outlaw. And this also, not so coincidentally, linked up with, around the same time, you had Touko Laaksonen, better known as Tom of Finland, drawing and painting these male icons, which were sort of circulating through the gay underground of the time, especially through sort of what they euphemistically called physique magazines back then. And this was the idea of sort of a very different masculine male archetype for the gay man, which is the charismatic outsider, masculine, capable, that became an extremely powerful image. And so we got the situation of gay men sort of, if not actually participating, then at least gesturing towards the gay biker archetype, even if they didn't actually ride a bike. And there was, of course, like the physical appeal of leather in and of itself. Even in Britain, you had, there was a movie called The Leather Boys, which was about what they call the cafe racer subculture of bikers who also wore leather, and some of whom sort of overlapped with the gay underground then. That created that image. And you can see that sort of moving outwards into other areas of even in heterosexual kink style, often with the officers' caps, the black leather jackets.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that we sort of came out of World War II, and you see this a lot in the movies, was the association of kink and fascism. Now, this is really a manifestation of a much longer trend of associating sexual deviance with political deviance.
Yep.
And so even back in the 1870s, you could see, for example, when the Franco-Prussian War, the French propaganda depicted the Prussian soldiers as sort of this mindlessly hypermasculine beasts and viewed the war itself in this sort of masculine aggression on feminine vulnerability. So even in the period leading up to World War II, and in World War I, of course, there was this view of viewing the war in very sexual terms. You had this famous poster labeled "Destroy This Mad Beast," and it showed a sort of a gorilla-like creature in a Prussian pickle hob helmet with a spike on the top, holding a swooning damsel in one paw and a club in the other. So again, we linked political deviance, fascism, linked with sadism as a form of propaganda. So in the post-war period, we started to see the genre of Nazi exploitation develop. So this was like pulp paperbacks, those old men's adventure magazines in the 50s and 60s with these sort of lurid painted covers with women, especially women in SS uniforms, dominating men. Now, this is a very peculiar development because the Nazi ideal of womanhood is very demure and domestic. So the whole image of the sadistic Nazi female commandant is really a creation of people sort of outside of fascism looking in on it, associating it with the political system of fascism is so deviant that it enables the deviance of an aggressive woman, which is even more perverse than an aggressive sadistic man. This kind of culminated in the 70s. There was a real boom in Nazi exploitation films. And you had some sort of highbrow stuff like The Night Porter by Liliana Cavini. But you also had these really sort of lower brow films like the Ilsa movies starring Diane Thorne. And the first one was Ilsa, she-wolf of the SS, who was positioned Ilsa as sort of this feminist insurgency within fascism, running this concentration camp. And by the end, she is apparently killed. But the producers found this was such a hit that a year later, they produced a movie called Ilsa, Harem Keeper of the Oil Sheiks. So somehow Ilsa is still alive. She's 30 years older. It hasn't aged a day. Now working for the other big enemies of the 1970s, oil sheiks. And it's kind of the same pattern plays out. Even the posters look similar. Then there's two other movies starring Diane Thorne. One was called, The Wicked Warden, which was her in a Latin American dictatorship. And finally, Ilsa, Tigress of Siberia. And that put her in the Stalinist gulags. The last two were repackaged as Ilsa movies, but there's this continuity here of the sexually monstrous woman, dominatrix, can be associated with any deviant political system, whether it's Nazis, oil sheiks, gangsters. She'll do it all. She's a floating symbol that can be attached to anything. That's when you got things like Susan Sontag's essay, Fascinating Fascism, which did a lot to sort of strengthen this view of that kink imagery is the link to the decadent sexuality of sadomasochism. Even then, we haven't really shrugged that off. Very often, if we want to make a woman look evil in film or TV, we put her in black leather or just black. Mm-hmm. And we're still seeing that today.
Yeah, I mean, it is so interesting that there's been this historical connotation between sadomasochism and fascist politics. And I think in that post-war period of the 1970s and 80s, that started to create some tension because you also had feminist writers at the time who were talking about sadomasochism as being a feminist act, as being a way that women could own their desires and their pleasures. And so there was this tension between those who were conflating sadomasochism with fascism and those sex positive activists who were saying that sadomasochism is a way that women can embrace their authentic sexuality or desires. And I think you're totally right that tension is still very much with us today in terms of the way people talk about this.
That was the lesbian feminist sex wars, that a very strong divide in the lesbian feminist movement that eventually sort of culminated in the Bernard Conference of 1982. And there was a lot of arguments. Arguably the sex positive feminists won, but there's still a sort of a strong anti-kink sentiment. Women like Sheila Jeffreys, for example, still writing in that vein. There's so much S&M influenced imagery around that, I cited superhero movies. I cited the music videos, for example, Madonna's Human Nature video. I can think of so many others. The image is ubiquitously visible, but what's the problem is what comes with it is not very enlightened or intelligent or educational. So the image is everywhere. The culture is nowhere. I mean, if you watch the two arguably the most successful, Secretary and the 50 Shades of Grey movies, SM is a very personal thing. It is conducted behind closed doors by heterosexual couples. I have mixed feelings about Secretary, but the one thing I really had a problem with was the sequence in which Lee, the protagonist, tries to connect with other kinky people. And they're all freaks and weirdos and perverts. And she just sort of scurries back to the character played by James Spader. And 50 Shades is like that even more so, is that Christian Grey has this red room of pain, but he's deeply in the closet about it. He's extremely secretive, and Anna, the character, has to sign an NDA before she'll see it. So it's extremely private. There's no cultural or political element to it. And I think that's really missing. I much prefer movies like Short Bus or even Preaching to the Perverted, which at least create the idea that there is a BDSM culture, that sexuality is not a purely private thing, and it is something to do, that there are things to be learned and experienced with multiple people in the world.
Looking to boost your bedroom performance? Our friends over at Popstar have you covered. The easy-to-use lidocaine-based Popstar Delay Spray relaxes nerve cells and postpones your climax, helping you to go the distance while keeping premature ejaculation and performance anxiety at bay. It's the strongest anti-climax spray in the market to maximize pleasure for both you and your partner, and importantly, it was formulated by doctors and is backed by science. Popstar's Delay Spray will not transfer to your partner, and you'll still feel everything, just for longer. It's also quick and easy, no pills, no weird rituals. Just spray, wait for it to take effect, and unlock your full bedroom potential. Boost your sexual confidence and performance with Popstar Delay Spray. Save 20% off your first order by using my name, Justin, as the discount code. Check the show notes for the link or visit popstarlabs.com/Justin. That's popstarlabs.com/Justin. And I was thinking a lot about how today BDSM is more visible than ever, thanks in part to mainstream media, but visibility doesn't always mean that you're getting accurate representations. And things like 50 Shades, I think, are a good example of how it has helped kink to permeate the cultural consciousness, but it doesn't necessarily perpetuate healthy or helpful ideas about a lot of aspects of kink and BDSM.
Yeah, the show Netflix ran a year or two ago, Bonding.
Mm-hmm.
The first season I had a lot of that idea that, this woman works as a pro dom and she dragoons her gay best friend into being her escort. But, there's no sense of like really getting to know the people she sees as people. She seems to have like, disdain for them. She's just doing it for the money. And they sort of haphazardly addressed that in the second season, where they did talk a bit about SM being a pro-dom. It requires at least some degree of empathy, that there are things like sesta fosta that affect this kind of work, that there is an SM culture and things like that. So I think they did definitely make improvements like that, but it's still very hard to find education. But again, like one of the things I run into in this whole question of, looking at representation of kink in mainstream media is like maybe the question of representation is in and of itself a decoy, a false choice. It's like, do we want to be going to the mainstream entertainment industry and holding up our bowls and saying, please, may we have some positive representation? Somebody pointed out, for example, reviewed the show Transparent. And one of the things they said is that there's not a good role model in the entire cast. It's like the character, the elderly man who very late in life is going through transition to a trans woman. She is a very flawed person who is still a very flawed person, even after transition. And it doesn't fundamentally make her a better person. We need to consider the less good representation and maybe taking a more warts and all approach to how we talk about kink and how we represent it. It's like we should ask, like, is education a part of it?
Mm-hmm.
We just finished Pride, and many people have commented rainbow capitalism seems to have receded. There's a lot fewer companies just slapping rainbows on stuff. I read an essay asking, is that a problem? I mean, we've revealed our fair weather friends because of this. So maybe it's better that we don't have everybody just hopping on the bandwagon because it superficially looks good. Maybe we should stop playing this game of trying to court, superficial approval from authorities and try to express ourselves. And I do think it's important that, like, nowadays it's never been easier to make our own and distribute our own media, like what we're doing right now, of course. So I've seriously reconsidered the whole question of representation. Arguably, one of the movies I think about most is David Cronenberg's film Crash, which is about people joining a cult of car crash fetishists. Mm-hmm. And what I found interesting about this is that there is really no attempt whatsoever to make things comfortable for the viewer. The people who enter in this car crash cult are not like Brad and Janet at the beginning of Rocky Horror Picture Show. They're already, very strange people who are, having multiple partners and exhibitionist sex and things like that. So, just getting into car crash fetishes is a natural progression. It's not trying to play in Peoria. I'm speaking this from an outsider. Maybe we need to be unapologetic in the media we make and not try to court acceptability.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of interesting questions to be raised about representation of minority sexualities in media. And so, something I was thinking about was, think about a movie like The Birdcage from the 1990s, which represented a very stereotypic portrayal of a gay couple. And it was a movie that made homosexuality and same-sex relationships very accessible to the masses. Yes, it relied very much on stereotypes. It wasn't an accurate representation of everyday life for gay men, but it was something that I think for many people helped to foster more social acceptance of this particular group, and I think about my parents in particular, like this was, a couple of years before I came out, and having that representation, I think actually helped in some ways with my own coming out process, because it made homosexuality this relatable thing, because it was a movie my parents loved and they saw these gay characters that they just enjoyed. And, even though it was stereotypic, it still did positive things. And if you advance in time and think about something totally different, like Bonding, that Netflix series that you talked about, my controversial opinion is that I actually loved the first season. I thought it was very humorous and entertaining, but I wasn't looking at it as a documentary or as, like a how-to guide for kink and BDSM, but just from a pure entertainment standpoint, like I connected with it. But then in the second season, it went in this totally different direction of being very preachy and like saying that we have to say, here's the accurate representation. And it took all the joy out of watching it for me because, when I'm consuming entertainment, and I think for a lot of other people, when they're consuming entertainment, they want to watch kind of the fantasy and have something that's a little bit disconnected from reality, as opposed to something that, again, is just like a pure documentary and reminding them of the realities of everything in everyday life. So it's a complex question in terms of how accurate do you want things to be? And do you want universally positive representation? And it's a difficult question.
Yeah. Going back to 1979, when they were filming Cruising, that was like only 10 years after Stonewall. For most people, gays in mainstream media was The Boys in the Band, which was like, all about homosexual self-loathing, even among the sort of assimilated ones. Like this was directed by William Friedkin, who was notorious for directing The Exorcist and The Boys in the Band. Gay activists were very upset about this. They were worried about, oh my God, more about gay serial killers, as had been a staple of movies since at least the original Psycho. And they were literally disrupting filming by like playing loud music or blasting air horns near the sets. But like people look back on Cruising, for example, now as almost this time capsule of gay life just before AIDS hit, and what, New York City gay life was like back then. And, a lot of those guys in the crowd scenes were the actual recruited from the leather clubs back then. And this movie itself is kind of a Rorschach test. If you're already predisposed to be homophobic, you're going to see this as like a self-destructive, culturally sick bunch of depraved hedonists. And if you're pro-gay, you're going to see this maybe with even a bit of nostalgia of what gay life was like prior to AIDS and things like that. And so it's hard to see how people are going to react to things. I'm so up in the air about this because, like you say, I just want my entertainment. But you also said that like watching The Birdcage as a young guy, not even out yet, that made you at least feel a little better about the idea of being gay and being out. And that's great. But I also feel like there's the other message of the stereotype, the effeminacy, the whole, association with dancing and entertainment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even that they have to go into a closet to appease their kids' in-laws, stuff like that. That's a part of it too. Was that good? Was that harmful? If, at what price visibility? At what price acceptability?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair question. And I think it goes back to, sometimes we kind of have to accept the representations, warts and all, in that you're not going to have a perfect representation that's going to please everybody. And, a lot of these representations aren't necessarily going to change somebody else's mind. And they are a Rorschach test in a lot of ways, where if you have very strong opinions to start with, you're going to see something very different when you consume this media. And I think where there's real potential to change is for people who are somewhere in the middle, and where a representation might make something a little bit more accessible to those individuals. But at the same time, it might also create some misconceptions and misleading ideas too. So there's no perfect way to do it. But I think that's also where we need to go back to having sex education that covers a lot of these different topics, that's comprehensive.
Yeah, maybe sex education should be that and not have to sugarcoat it with our entertainment.
Yeah, well, like why does porn and popular media have to be the default form of sex education? If we actually gave people good sex ed to begin with.
I remember in the US Queer as Folk, there was a show within the show called Gay as Blazes, which was also the characters in the show criticized for being too sugarcoaty and, avoiding all the controversial ideas of the actual show. Like the main relationship between a adult man and a late teens guy. And I think you hit the nail on the head here, is that we shouldn't ask our entertainment to do our education as well.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. And we could talk at length about a show like Queer as Folk and the depiction of a relationship between a high school student and a guy in his 30s. That's a very different kind of representation. But anyway, we could have a whole extensive conversation about this. But it has been a pleasure to chat with you, Peter, and to learn about the history of kink and BDSM. So can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your book?
I'm on historyofbdsm.com. I'm also History of BDSM on X and on Blue Sky. You can buy my book at the usual places: A Lover's Pinch, A Cultural History of Sadomasochism. I hope that I can reach out to more people through this.
And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thanks again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Good talking with you, Justin.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.